Matthew as the president of ASCLD and the chair of the Consortium of Forensic Science Organizations is uniquely qualified to moderate a panel of this nature on standards, because that is very much within the wheelhouse of both of those organizations. He attended undergraduate and graduate schools at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, completed a certificate program in laboratory management through West Virginia University, the University of California at Davis, and graduated as a certified public manager in the Idaho program. He began his career working in the Spokane laboratory of the Washington State Patrol as a biologist and DNA scientist, as well as responding to crime scenes, and then began his career with the Idaho State Police in late 2008 as a systems quality manager, was promoted to laboratory system director over 3 laboratories in the Idaho State Police in 2014. I would invite Matthew to introduce his panel for this afternoon.
Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to bring this panel to you today. When they talked about accreditation and standards, I reached out to some of my friends that you see here on the panel. They are all uniquely qualified in the niche that they fill, and I appreciate them making their travel schedules and other things and other arrangements today. So first on our panel today, we'll have Karin Athanas. Karin is the Government and Regulatory Affairs person for A2LA. A2LA is my accrediting body, and I appreciate all the work that she's done personally for me as the former program manager for forensic science. So she has unique qualifications and has been newly appointed to the U.S. ISO tag. So she has many hats that she wears, and we appreciate her being with us. We'll then hear from Karin Knutson. Karin is the director at the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and she's been the director there for 5 years. She has 2 labs and about 130 employees that she supervises. She is here today to talk about the US ISO tag, and her background is in DNA and crime scene analysis. She'll be followed by Lucy Davis, and Lucy is retired from the Kentucky State Police. She's currently the chair of the American Standards Board. She's a member of the FSSB, and she currently serves as a private consultant, and her travel repertoire is enviable. She's been to Vietnam recently and a number of countries around the world to help them with implementation of DNA labs and other initiatives. And then we have Mark Stolorow. Mark is the director of OSAC Affairs with the Special Programs Office at NIST. Some history that you may not know about Mark is he co-chaired the SOFS, the Subcommittee on Forensic Science, that was run by the White House a number of years ago, was instrumental in setting up, I was hearing with Ken Melson, setting up not only the OSAC, but also the National Commission on Forensic Science. His background is he had 17 years as a practitioner with the Michigan State Police and also Illinois State Police, and then 19 years as a private, working at a private laboratory at Orchid Cellmark Laboratories. It may have just been Cellmark at that point, right, Mark?
Both.
And then in 2008, he took his position at NIST, and he's been there ever since. So a very qualified panel before you today, and we'll start with Karin.
We're talking about the changes. Most laboratories are accredited to 17025, which is the international accreditation standard for testing and calibration laboratories. And just last year in November, the ISO organization issued a new version of the standard, the 2017 version. So in this presentation, I'm just introducing the big changes between the 2 standards. So obviously things change all the time. It's our least favorite thing in the world. In regards to ISO, they have a 5-year renewal cycle. So all of their published standards, every 5 years, there's a question that comes up of, do we need to change the standard? In 2010, when this came up, they said, no, don't do that. In 2015, they said, well, maybe we have to at this point. So in 2015, they began the process to revive the standard, and as you can see, it took them all the way until 2017 to kind of get to the final point. And that's typical for standards. It does take 2 or 3 years to get through that revision process. So some big changes that happened in the standard. ISO, the CASCO committee oversees the structure and the format of the standards that ISO publishes. And before the revision process started, they actually came up with a new setup that all of the standards have to meet. So if you look at other published standards like the 17020, which is what a lot of crime scene units are accredited to, that has the new standard, the new setup of 8 sections, where 17025, the old version, had 5 sections, 3 that were normative and scope, and 4 and 5 had all the basic requirements. Now we have 8 sections, where everything that was kind of in section 4 is now in section 8, and everything else is from 2 to 7. Some other changes is they removed a lot of requirements for procedures. They really moved towards this idea of a process. A lot of that has to do with the fact that these days laboratories use electronic systems, and so you wouldn't have to have a written procedure that says do step 1, step 2. You might have an electronic system that requires that you follow it. So it's really a process look and rather than a written procedure. So like I said, the 8 sections are now in place. There's less administrative procedures. There's a stronger emphasis on competence, so technical competence. Laboratory management, and all of these I'm going to get into in a little bit more in detail in the future slides, but laboratory management, it's still there that management has to perform certain functions, but they've removed references to the titles that people have to have. They've added this thing called decision rules, which is often used in calibration, and they've just moved it so it also applies to testing laboratories. They've included this idea of risks and opportunities, which kind of replaces what used to be preventive action for laboratories, because what we saw when we assessed them is they never really used preventive action. It was a really hard thing to identify what needed a preventive action. So they've changed it more to an idea of risk and then opportunities for improvement. There are now PT requirements, stronger PT requirements in the standard. The thing to emphasize here is there were always PT requirements, but they've just moved them from someplace else into the standard. There's also, impartiality was in the standard originally, but now it's throughout the standard, so they've added a lot more references to it. And then finally, stronger complaint handling process. So there are some new definitions found in the standard. I did bring a copy with me today, so if you'd like to see some of those definitions, I'm happy to show you those. Certainly the community as a whole knew these definitions, but we felt it was really beneficial for the laboratories to see them in the standard itself. So getting into the actual changes in regards to our impartiality, which is just defined as being objective, they've included it throughout the document. It's actually the very first set of requirements is that the laboratory must be impartial, and as well as ensuring the impartiality of its employees and its staff from outside influences, their own influences. You know, we were talking about human factors today. A lot of those ideas, the laboratory has to consider the risks to impartiality and what they need to do to ensure it. In regards to laboratory management, I did mention this previously. They removed references to specific titles. As an example, the old standard said you must have a quality manager or however named. So now it doesn't say you have to have a quality manager, but it still says you must have an individual with these job functions. So in theory, it's still there, but they don't reference a specific person that has that job function. And the idea is that multiple people could do that function, but you still need somebody that's in charge of ensuring that the standards applied, the requirements of the laboratory are applied, the procedures are followed, the quality control is held to. Personnel competence. In the 17020 standard, we've all gotten really used to it. For 020, it's all about professional judgment, so their competence requirements, there's just a whole bunch of requirements related to it. For 025, they've kind of moved the standards into 025 as well, where the laboratory really has to come up with procedures for determining what the competence requirements for their staff are, and that's experience, educational background, training, certification. So now putting the onus on the laboratories to spell it out, what their staff has to meet, and then ensuring that their laboratory staff does in fact meet it. Included in that is they've also broadened it. I think the next slide does that. They've also broadened what that covers as well. Previously, they looked at just the testing itself. So if I have to do this test, what do I need to have experience and competence-wise? Now they've said, no, that also includes reviewing contracts, sampling, uncertainty calculation. You can't just, hand wave it. All of these are essential functions of the laboratory, so you have to have competence requirements for these as well. And this also applies to external competence. A big change they did to the standard is they've removed references to having a supplier of services. Now they just call it external provider. So if you outsource testing, if you purchase a service, you purchase supplies, if that all affects the activities the laboratory is performing, it falls into what are your competence requirements for that external provider, providing evidence that you did assess them to those and that they met them. So now a lot more emphasis on everybody has to meet kind of the same requirements as the laboratory. And they also would include assessment to the laboratories, the accreditation requirements where applicable. So if they do outsource testing, we're looking for the evidence that they've evaluated that provider to see if they do meet the requirements of the standard that would apply to them. So for like calibration or for testing. Decision rules. Decision rules is something that calibration laboratories have been doing for forever. But we've moved it into the standard to apply it to the testing laboratories as well. And this is something that we've debated a lot. I actually had a 2-hour conversation with somebody talking about decision rules and how this will apply, especially in forensics, because of the testing that's done is kind of unique compared to other industries. So, what we like to emphasize at this point is that decision rules is very specific to tests that are quantitative or include a quantitative function where measurement uncertainty is calculated as part of the test. And for the decision rule to apply, your customer has to request that you report a conformance to a requirement. So you're saying your report says pass-fail. If your report doesn't say pass-fail, if it has a numerical value, then you don't have to worry about this. But if your report is going to say pass-fail, so like a tox test, then you have to include and have a conversation with your customer about whether you include the uncertainty with the pass-fail. Do you exclude it? Do you minus it from the result? So that they know when they see pass-fail, they'll know what that means. And also have to include it in the report itself so that any other person that reads the report knows what it means. For proficiency testing, we have, if you're an accredited laboratory, this has no effect on you at all. What they found is that the organization that we answer to, which is ILAC, had a P-series document that said if you accredit a laboratory, you must also apply these proficiency testing requirements. Well, when they revised the standard, they said, you know what, these are requirements that everybody should meet. So if somebody says they're meeting the standard but they're not accredited, they should also be meeting these PT requirements. It shouldn't just apply to the ones that get accredited. So they moved it into the standard, and it essentially says, you have to participate in commercial PT where available. And the big difference there is PT is run by an external provider who doesn't participate in the test. Laboratories are still permitted to do an inter-laboratory comparison, which is a test that involves multiple laboratories, but they run it themselves, so they participate in it. But it brings in that element of comparing your results with other laboratories, so you get that population idea of, am I matching up with this lab across the street from me? Resolving complaints is new for the 17025 accredited laboratories. It's not new for other standards, but it puts the onus on laboratories that they must handle their own complaints. So, and I wrote it down, so I say it correctly. Hold on. So what it says is that the laboratory has to have a description of the handling process for complaints, and it must make it available to any party that requests it. So they must have a written process for how they handle complaints, and if you ask them for a copy, they have to give it to you. It also requires that upon receipt of a complaint, that it's their responsibility to evaluate it, and if they confirm that it has an effect on laboratory activities that they control, they now are responsible for dealing with it themselves. So they can't push it to a secondary vendor. They have to process that themselves and report those results to the complainant if they can. So it adds a lot more onus on them to determine, okay, is this something that I control that affects my activities? If it doesn't, okay, they can push that to somebody else. But if it does, they have to handle it themselves. For the management system, this will not have a huge effect on forensic laboratories. Essentially, what the AB option is a lot of laboratories live within manufacturing plants, and many manufacturing plants seek a 9001 registration. ISO 9001 is a management system standard. It's very similar to the Section 4 of the old standard, but it essentially says you must do management reviews, you must do internal audits, you must have a complaint process. So any manufacturing facility that's gone through the trouble of getting a 9001 registry, they said, well, I don't want to also then get assessed to the exact same requirements for my laboratory if I've already assessed my laboratory to the 9001. So they added the A and B option to allow the manufacturing organization to say, I already have these policies and procedures because I'm 9001. So when us, the accreditation body, comes in, we go, okay, they've got the policies and procedures in place. They have the tools in place to do it correctly. What we're going to look at is, are they doing it correctly? So it changes the way we assess it when we go on site. Because certainly we know you can have all the rules you want, but you could still not follow them, right? Other changes is management system. The control of documents and control of records is the same, but like I said, there's less requirements for procedures. There are, I think, only 2 requirements for policies, but what it does say is the laboratory needs to create policies where it's necessary. So what you're seeing is a lot less policies stated in their system other than what they think is like essential. And for our purposes, policy just means a rule. And then the procedure says how to do the rule. Risks and opportunities. So risk, I think everybody's going to struggle with this forever because, you know, risk. We have a lot of classes on it and how to handle it, but essentially it's, okay, when something happens, is this so dire I have to now do a full corrective action to prevent it never happens again? Or is it something really minor, it doesn't affect test results, I can just do a correction and it most likely won't happen again? So now laboratories are doing this evaluation to determine, okay, what is the risk of taking action and not taking action? And they do this for impartiality, they do this for corrective actions, they do this for when they decide how much their procedures have to be documented versus not documented. So there's real emphasis on the laboratories considering what's the effect if I don't take action. For corrective action, it no longer says root cause analysis, but it does require that laboratories identify the cause or causes. And the intent really was to say there may not always be just one root cause. The laboratory really needs to consider the full spectrum of their system and what could have contributed to the issue they're trying to address so that they really look at everything they'd have to do to prevent recurrence. But essentially the requirement is the same. It just doesn't say root cause anymore. Internal audits and management reviews are very different now. It does still kind of require a documented process. See how I said process? Well, in processes, they really emphasize the ins and the outs. So the procedure really isn't there, but identification of what needs to be evaluated as the in and what needs to be reported or recorded as the out is in the standard. And I do have that if you want to see what the ins and outs are. Okay, that is it. I know it's a lot. I could get way more into the weeds, but this is a quick kind of overview. Any questions? Go ahead, Sarah.
So I agree that the 2017 version does a much better job of explaining and detailing the importance of cause analysis and corrective action. And I'm hoping we can help with this. From my non-expert review, I wanted to look for information about correction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of information about what you do to help the lab not have a problem again. There's one line on actually fixing the problem that was identified.
Mm-hmm.
And that ties into duty to correct, that ties into who gets notified when problems happen. And so I was wondering if where I would find that in 2017 or if that's something that the laboratory has to develop themselves.
Well, I mean, for our purposes, the difference between correction and corrective action, the great example I like to use is, say you walk into your laboratory one day, you walk by the fridge, and there's water all over the floor. So your issue is that your fridge is clearly leaking water all over the floor. Your correction is to mop up the water. Your corrective action is to figure out why the fridge is broken and fix it. So the standard really emphasizes the corrective action, because obviously the ideal is that they prevent recurrence. But a laboratory might choose to just do a correction for various reasons. If the fridge isn't actually broken, it's just leaking water, the temperature is staying the same, so the samples aren't affected, then I might choose to just continue to do a correction until they have the money to fix it. But for us, we like to emphasize that we'd prefer you do the corrective action. There are more language. I don't think they get too much in the weeds in the 17025 because it's more of a, hey, look at this as a kind of best case scenario effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sort of.
So for the accreditation experts here, I would love to get a better sense of where the direction is.
Mhm.
I feel like maybe at the cost of having more corrective action language, that there isn't very much on correction.
No, I agree. There isn't a lot of language separation.
Yes, you mentioned that there's now a requirement that we have a written policy for handling complaints. Must it be available to the customer or to the public? Because unless there's a difference now, they are vastly different.
Any interested party. I'm quoting from the standard. So that literally means anybody.
But there's not a requirement that it be posted online. Is there? I mean, any interested party would mean anybody who requests it, wouldn't it?
Yes.
There is no requirement that they put it on their website. Correct.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll have some time after for questions too, so therefore we can come.
Thank you.
Representing the US ISO tag, and she's going to talk to us about international standards that are coming and evolving, so. Thanks, Kathy.
I've spent the last couple of years working with the TC272 ISO United States tag, and I'll explain to you kind of what that is while the video is going here. So what that really is this is a group of individuals who have decided that there is an additional potential need for some more forensic specific standards. Really getting the individuals in the room, there's an international need for this. And so this is a group that we meet twice a year. We have United States components, so we are one group, a mirror group, where we then meet with other countries to discuss the needs of forensic science globally. So what we're hoping to do is be able to come up with some forensic standards that can be utilized across borders, that can kind of provide some more best practices and some more guidance for those who may not be using the 17025 or 17020 with the supplementals. Okay. So the ISO Technical Committee 272, we were established in 2012, again, because there was a need that was identified internationally that it would be nice to have some more standards that were specific to forensic science. Because right now, we're using 17025, that works great for testing laboratories and calibration laboratories. 17020 is one that has kind of gained some traction with some of our crime scene units for lack of additional, not really wanting to go the 17025 route, but really going with the decision-based. And then there's a lot internationally where neither one of these is what they use. Instead, within their own countries, they have their own national standards, or they're in the process of developing their own national standards. So the goal is to try and integrate everybody together and at least have one set of standards that organizations involved in analysis or interpretation of physical evidence for the purpose of presenting conclusions in court, but also for manufacturers of consumables that are utilized in forensic laboratories across the world. There needs to be, and that was the original need that was identified by this group, is that we were having some issues with some consumables for DNA testing. And it was identified that it would be, maybe this is an area where standards could be created, standards can be developed, and can give some more guidance and some more minimum requirements for these manufacturers who would like to then self-assess and state that they are compliant with these so that their consumables are appropriate for use in forensic DNA testing. That is one of the standards, that's the only standard so far that this TC272 has published, and I'm gonna go into a little bit more of the ones that are in progress right now. These do not include quality management standards, so there's a huge difference between these standards and 17025 and 17020. These are really the basic standards for, say, for example, a local crime lab who only responds to crime scenes. They do forensic processing on scene, limited forensic processing from, just responding and documenting, all the way to doing some field testing analysis on the scene, collecting evidence and bringing it back. That is an area that I feel, I've been in forensic science for quite some time now, that has really not gotten a lot of attention. That is an area where you can make or break a case if the evidence is not collected in a manner in which it's going to make sure that you are not changing it, you're not altering it, you're not degrading it, or the chain of custody is intact. So there's a lot of things that can really go wrong at the front end, but there's also a lot of things that really need to go right at the front end in order to make sure that the entire process is going to be one that is going to be kind of stand up in court at the end of the day. Some other sampling of some other technical committees. You can see forensic sciences, we're stuck right in there between plastics and rubber machines and lighting. So these technical committees, there's about 100 of them, a little over 100 of them in the ISO program. So this is something that happens all the time. We're just really happy that we're on the list now and that we can really focus on the needs of our community. So there's about 300 of them now. And actually there's over like 22,000 ISO standards published to date. So these are really busy groups. They work tirelessly. They hash out debates between not only within our own country, but also across borders, which can get incredibly challenging sometimes. This particular TC272, this particular technical committee is made up of about, there we go. The blue are the actual participating countries. So you can see this is a worldwide effort. The blue are the participating countries, and then the orange are observers. And really the only difference is it comes down to commenting, voting, etc. So that's really the main difference. And then the secretariat for this is Australia. Australia is a group that has some very robust and very detailed national standards that we are actually using for seed documents as we start developing these additional standards for forensic science. ISO tagline, when the world agrees. So you can understand why the creation of some of these standards can take even just an update 2-3 years. They do have timelines on them, some pretty strict timelines as to what you need to get done within a certain amount of time, but this is not an easy process. The goal is to really develop standards with a consensus in mind. It's a consensus-based development of standards. We had to keep everything into consideration, not just the rules and regulations of the United States, but rules and regulations of every country and what it is that they may intend to do with these standards. And that really changes the narrative sometimes when we're having these conversations. If we're sitting in Germany, for example, and their national rule is that if an ISO standard exists, you must follow it, they're going to have a lot of different input as to what they feel is appropriate for this. And everybody across the globe needs to be cognizant of that and respectful of that and really get back to the root of what is a standard for? What does a standard really need to do? So far, as I said, we published one standard, that's ISO 18385. And really what that does is that's for minimizing contamination or minimizing negative impacts of consumables on forensic analyses. We all know with DNA testing, a lot of times you get one shot, and if you're getting the person who created the tube, then you've kind of lost that. And unfortunately, that there has some, as DNA has grown and the sensitivities have gotten to the level that they are, this was a standard that they felt at the time was very important to get out there, and this is that end product from that. We are also working on 6 other additional documents. That top one really kind of takes, and that's the newest one, that's under development, and it is looking at kind of the consumables that are used in non-DNA areas of forensic science. Is there a need for this? Are there additional consumables that we really need to be considering having some sort of a minimum requirement for our vendors and our manufacturers to look to in order to know that the products that they're putting out there are what the forensic laboratories want, it's what they need, and it's not going to negatively impact that testing. The second one here is a 21043-1. Now, this is kind of changed since the beginning of the inception of this process, and now what we have developed are essentially a suite of documents. There's 5 documents, at least at this point in time, that is the intention, that there are going to be 5 documents. And really what the goal is so that there's a document for each entity. If there's a law enforcement agency who does crime scene processing and crime scene processing only and then sends it off to a forensic laboratory, then they can stick with the 21043-1, which is terms and definitions. Everybody has to have those, and that will evolve as the other documents are finished. But also, they will have, and this is the one that is now a final draft, so it's to the point where the comment period is such that if you don't just have a comment about a dash or a period or a spelling, then keep your comments to yourself, because we have gone through several rounds of commenting for these, both public and within the TC, and it has been extensive. We're really kind of excited about getting to this point. What is the first step? Recognition, recording, collecting, transport, and storage. That's it. If that's all you do, then now there is a standard that is going to be available for those entities so that they can then have something as a reference to utilize. Now the next 3 kind of takes it to the final 3 pieces. But here's the 21043-1, terms and definitions. This is what they look like when they get to this point, and everybody gets really excited on the TC because it doesn't have all these numbers on it. Yes, we're getting there, finally, maybe. What, weeks, in the coming weeks, the coming months, is that the term to use? So these 2 are to that point. We're pretty much done with them. We're now moving on to the next 3, which is 21043-3, which is that next logical step, analysis and examination. So it's what happens to the evidence once it gets into either a laboratory facility, or if there's some sort of a laboratory set up within law enforcement, now that be here in the US or across the globe, because everybody does things a little bit differently, that there's going to be some specific standards for that, followed by interpretation and reporting. So an entity can use all of these, it can use a subset of these, it's what's most pertinent and relevant to the work that's being done within their organization. Again, and then the newest one is the one at the top there, which are specifications for consumables, non-DNA. How do we even start doing something like this? Well, I said at the beginning that we have 17025, we have 17020, we have some really robust supplementals, but each international entity also may have their own set of national standards. And what we did with this one is, when we start a document through this process, you need to start at ground zero, so a seed document. Where can we start? Now, it might not look anything like that document at the end of the day, but it's somewhere to start. And in this particular case, the primary seed documents were coming out of Australia, and it's actually structured in the way that they have theirs as well. So this has been done before, it works well for them, so we figured, and they're also the secretariat of our technical committee, we figured this is a good place to start and move from there. Other seed documents, and when the United States got involved, these aren't necessarily the official seed documents, however, there is a nexus on our US tag with NIST, so that when these recommendations or standards, best practices are coming out of the OSAC, we can use that information and ensure that it is aligned with these standards that are coming out. So that what we're doing on this committee is to make sure that there's nothing going to end up in these standards that's going to be contradictory with what where we're going in the United States, and to make sure that our voice is heard. As I said, it's a lot of countries. It's 24 countries, or 23. I think actually we had another one just add. I've seen 23, but the most recent is 24. This is 24 countries with varying levels of intentions and varying levels of plans for using these that are contributing to this. So it's important to have very sound seed documents and build upon all of the work that's already been done. This isn't new ground, it's just trying to get it into a format where we have some standards that can be utilized and standardize things across the globe. So the US tag means Technical Advisory Group. It has the administrator, which is ASCLD, and ANSI. ANSI is actually the ISO member. Each country is one member to the ISO, and they're the representative for the United States. Now, additional entities and organizations are also represented on this US tag, and it shows you the diversity that we have on this technical group. We have ANAB, the Defense Forensics and Biometrics Agency, ASIA, which is the American Society of Criminal Investigation Agencies. NIST is a partner in this as well. We have AFS, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and then also most recently AFCLAM, which is the American Forensic Quality Assurance Managers group. So this is a lot of different backgrounds who are coming together. It's hard to get the world to agree when we are having we need to make sure we have the U.S. agree first. And so it's really been an excellent endeavor. I think these are going to be some pretty solid standards that are going to be available for usage. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and stand for questions or pass it off to the next panelist. Yes, sir.
This is, ISO is international, but the OSACs are going to, what they're sending out to the registry is going to be mandatory in some senses for practices in the medicine. So how is, I know you said something about harmonization. How is this going to eventually, is one going to dominate, do you think?
No, and that's not the intention. The intention is to have options. And if these standards we get to the point where they are final published standards, and then that will be for the OSAC to decide whether or not those should go on the registry. It's not going to be one or the other. It could just be a combination of all, and really depending on the work that's being done within the laboratory. And if, yes, we do have that OSAC representatives.
Right, so we do have coordination among participants in all of those groups as well as the SBOs, and I'll address that at the end, the standard developing organizations. And it's a mandate for us to make sure that we're not creating standards in conflict with one another. Part of the recognition process is to have elevated and endorsed ISO 17025 and 17020 to the registry. So the OSAC registry already contains international standards. So it's not lost on us that we're operating in an environment. But we were told by NSFE at the first meeting that I was called to give a presentation in a closed-door session before the governing board of NSFE. And I said, wow, this is a pretty big deal. Do I have to swear in? They said, no, but we want you to understand that when OSAC catches cold, when OSAC sneezes, the rest of the world catches cold. I said, I don't get that. And they said, we are impacted so much by news that comes out of the United States in every court, every jurisdiction. You cannot operate independently without having an unwanted impact on all of the other people who watch the United States. So that was a warning that we got 3 years ago, and we're trying to be faithful. We just don't spend a lot of time advertising the fact that we're in close communication with the rest globally on standards development, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't spend a lot of time articulating.
Good. The committees that make these standards, are they going to maintain them every, you said 5 years?
I believe they are up for review every 5 years, and they will be under review by either the committee or the committee in its form at that point in time.
The ISO board, since it is under the ISO board, the ISO is basically the SDO that is maintaining that standard. So they will maintain, members of that committee may rotate off and rotate on, but it is their obligation to maintain it, and if the committee no longer exists, then the standard will be sunsetted. Because if there's not a committee there to maintain it, then it sunsets.
I have two questions. One is, does Committee 272 have subcommittees or working groups for particular disciplines that develop standards that are discipline specific, like fingerprint subcommittee or working group, question document working group, tool mark working group. Do you have that in your setup? And if not, why? And then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, and there are working groups that are set up, and they rotate through. Again, it depends on the projects that are under development at any point in time. Right now, we have 5 projects going, and we have 4 working groups right now assigned to participate in that. Now, each country is responsible for making sure that if they need a subject matter expert, we do call on that so that we do have that input, that if we feel like it's going to indirectly or directly affect any specific discipline or one specific action, that we will pull in for some SMEs to make sure that we're getting that information from the ground level as well. The individuals on the U.S. tag also have a diverse background. You know, there are many of us who are laboratory directors. We've come up with various, with Mines Indian and crime scene. We have a drug chemist, and as well as people with some trace analysis experience. So the experience is there, but the working group is not so granular at that TC international level at this point in time that it goes into individuals.
And I would say as well, that the U.S. tag has kind of gone through a metamorphosis, if you will. The first thing it was working on was specific to DNA reagents. And so on that group were companies like Omega and others that had a stake in the game, so to speak. Those groups rotated off, and now this new consortium that we have is more constructed of the organizations, and then we will bring in the technical expertise as we need it, depending on what standard is being worked on.
The last question is, what procedures do you employ to ensure that one particular stakeholder interest does not dominate the standard setting process? And also, do you review national standards development organizations to see if they've complied with, let's say, due process requirements?
Well, to answer your first question, the process, and I can speak from experience, I was at one of the recent meetings in Madrid, everybody gets a voice. And it is a process very similar to other standards development, where it goes through an initial working group, it goes through several rounds of comments and changes and trying to really get the scope dialed in, and then it goes through several additional, and that's inside the working groups that have been established. And then it is released to the entire TC, which is, you know, it has 23 odd countries. Each one of those countries has several additional members that are necessary, that are representative, and all of those individuals in each of those countries and their governing their tag comments on those.
Do all those members of the TC, outside of the work, once it goes to that process, do they all have a vote in terms of approval of the standard or not? Because that's not a situation in some American standards development organizations.
At the TC level, each country gets the vote. So everybody gets a vote.
Okay, so it's not limited just to members of the working group. Thank you.
We're going to move on. We hopefully will have time for more questions at the end, but thank you, Kathy, for your presentation. Now we're going to move to Lucy Davis, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the work at the ASB and also OSAC standards implementation.
Okay, thank you all for having me come speak to you today. And I'm bringing in 2 different aspects of this concept of standards, one of which is from my role as the chair of the Academy Standards Board, which is an SDO, and the concept of standards. And then the other one is we're going to get these standards and how are we going to implement them. So they may seem like 2 different talks, but actually they go hand in hand in the process. So first of all, we have heard the word standard in this room quite a bit today. But you have to understand there are different types of standards. Standards can be developed differently. Kathy was just talking about ISO standards. And ISO standards are developed on the international stage with input from specific countries across the globe. ANSI, or the American National Standards Institute, is, like she said, the U.S. representative to ISO. And ANSI into itself is a nonprofit organization that oversees the creation, promulgation, and use of thousands of norms or guidelines that cover over 270,000 companies, up to 30 million people. You know, forensics standards is not a new thing. Most of the world has them and has operated under them. And standards are out there to help commerce and help things move along. So standards is something that's been there. There's a process that has been developed to make sure that they're written well and written in a way that is fair and balanced. And now we're using those tools that the rest of the world has had and applying them within the forensic process. Also, ANSI, being the American National Standard Institute, also accredits SDOs, Standard Development Organizations. SDOs that are accredited can submit their standards they develop to become an American national standard. An American national standard deemed by ANSI is a standard that is developed following the ANSI essential requirements of due process. So those are things that you need to look at and hear and understand with the different types and how standards are made. The best thing to remember is that the essential requirements require specific things. One, consensus is reached from representatives of the materially affected and interested parties. So anybody who is affected or has an interest in that standard must have input into it. The standards require public reviews, when any member of the public can submit a comment. An ANS standard also, when they get those comments, the consensus body must respond to those comments and resolve them. And at the end, it also must have an appeals process. Even if that standard is written, there must be some way that people can file an appeal. I've got two different things going on here, and I missed the second one. So now, the Academy Standards Board. ASB was established to help address the void of within SDOs for the forensic disciplines. So there are SDOs out there that do have forensic standards. You have ASTM, you have the American Dental Association, you have the National Fire Prevention Association. These SDOs have written forensic-based standards, but there are some areas that weren't covered by these. And so we have now developed 12 different consensus bodies that are addressing some of the areas that have OSAC subcommittees within them. Right now, with ASB, we have almost 400 active members of our 12 consensus bodies. Now, our consensus bodies are made, they must have between 7 and 25 people on it. The members of the consensus body must fall within those 8 categories to represent those people who may be affected or materially interested in the subject matter of it. Within our consensus bodies, no more than 1/3 of the membership can be represented by any one interest group. And also, we make sure that when it comes to balance, that if we don't have somebody representing an interest group, we do not fill up the consensus body. So if we do not have somebody that falls into the consumer interest group, Our consensus body will only have 24 members on it rather than the full 25 until we can find somebody to fill that interest category along the lines. Also, our consensus body meetings, anybody can call in and listen and observe those, and also have word and speak if they can be recognized, if they're recognized by the chair. On average, the ASB runs 35 meetings between consensus bodies and working groups a month. So there are a lot of meetings out there and a lot of work being done. All of those are advertised are placed on the calendar on the ASB website. So you can always call in and have your say on any one of our consensus bodies. The working groups are not open to the public comments because that's just that they're working. Right now, ASB has had 87 documents submitted to us, and we're actively working on 59 of those from those 12 bodies. One of the ways, I've got to remember this. An ASB document process, and I know a lot of people ask, what takes so long? And like it says, it takes a while to make sure that a good product is written and an appropriate product is reviewed. Now, a new work proposal is submitted to the ASB consensus body. ASB, all of our new work proposals have come from the OSAC subcommittees. And like we were talking about earlier, those are our seed documents. It makes things go quicker with the concept of those seed documents, whereas OSAC had to start from scratch and put the first word down on paper. We can take the documents that they have already worked on and use those as our seed product. ASB decides if the scope of that document falls within our process or our plan. Once we decide we're going to take that on, we then have the consensus body develop the document, and then once the consensus body has developed a document that they feel is complete, we then put it out for public comment. This public comment is a public comment. You will see, if you're a member of the Academy, we send out email blasts saying this document's out for public comment. We try to hit the other big forensic science associations and send it to their newsletters and their emails to say, get this information out to your public. The OSAC website says, this document is out for public comment. And so we get the public comment, it usually lasts for 6 weeks. When it comes back, the consensus body has to resolve every one of those comments. If the resolution of the comments is just a small matter of thing, then we can go ahead and vote it on through. If not, if the resolution of those comments would lead to a change in the document, then the document has to go out again for another round of public comments. And after that, and all the public comments are resolved, and then we adopt it as an ASB standard, and we submit it to ANSI. ANSI will look at our process and procedures and confirm that we did the process according to our accredited standards and due process, and when that's done, it is now determined to be an ANSI, an American National Standard. ASB is committed to all of our standards will be ANS standards and go through that process. And once we have that ANS standard on our documents, we will then put them on our website and they will be available for everybody free of charge. I'm thrilled to announce, last week, ASB just got our first ANS public standard, national standard, in a year and a half, which is very quick. Actually, most standard developing organizations is 3 to 5 years from the time a standard is started. So that first standard is now published. It's on our website, and you can go there and download it free of charge. Now, I like to point out to people, and they ask, why is OSAC doing all this stuff? And why, if OSAC does all of this evaluation of these documents they're running, why is it important to put it through an SDO process? And I'd like to introduce you to the life of ANSI ASB Standard 17. And this is standard practices for measurement traceability and forensic toxicology. And the OSAC subcommittee submitted it to ASB in October of 2016. In November, it was approved by ASB for development by our consensus body. Now, in December, you will notice that there was a national notification that ASB is working on this standard. This is where we were talking about a little bit earlier. SDOs do not want to step on each other's toes. So we publish on the national ANSI website that ASB is going to be writing a standard covering this scope. So at that point in time, other SDOs can contact us and say, wait 1 minute, we think we've got something that is similar, and you have to stop and figure it out between there. We have just had somebody notify us. We put out that we are going to work on a firearms standard, and another SDO said, wait 1 minute, we've got a similar standard in relationship to firearms and how they are made. So we are in the process of currently looking at what their standard is and what our scope is and making sure that we don't write a conflicting standard with it. So we got that approval. We went ahead and started working on it. The ASB consensus body thought, this is great. You know, we really like what OSAC gave us. They made a couple of tweaks on it, said, okay, let's send it out for public comment. Sent it out for 6-week public comment. They got 173 comments back on it. Of those comments, 27 of the commentators were outside OSAC and ASB. These were people commenting on from the methodology systems. The people who actually do traceability outside forensics, it's their job and they know it. And they came back and they commented. And when the consensus body got it back, they're like, wait 1 minute. This is appropriate. This is a good thing. They spent 7 months resolving those comments and integrating, researching, talking to the people who made the comments, making sure they understood it and making sure that the document appropriately represented how to do measurement traceability. 7 months later, pretty big change, so they sent it back out. This time there was only one comment and it was editorial. So they obviously remediated the comments well. The document has gone through that and it is sent up yesterday to ANSI to become an American National Standard. We have 4 more standards that we sent up this week to ANSI. We hope it should take about 6 weeks to get those back. So now we have these documents. These are standards. They're not only ASB standards, they're American national standards. They exist. What are we going to do with them? Same thing. Now we can send them back to OSAC and say, please consider if these standards that we have are fit for purpose. And so OSAC now has standards that they have deemed fit for purpose. What do? Now we got to convince people to implement them. We're going to have a lot of standards out there, but what's the use of having them if people don't use them? So the FSSB has been looking at an implementation plan. It is important that we get the different stakeholders to be interested and adopt these standards into their practices with it. The plan describes different strategies. These are not an end-all. It's not right now a full A to Z plan written out. We have now put down our initial thoughts of where we can go, grabbed initial stakeholders that we think are important, and we have put out, the document is now on the OSAC website, asking for comments and ideas and input to how we can get these standards implemented. First of all, we defined who are the probable stakeholders that would be interested in the standards and interested in adopting them. We look at the forensic service providers and medical service providers using self-adoption of it. We look at the OSAC members going external and encouraging their laboratories and their people to adopt them. We looked at the Forensic Science Professional Associations, if ASCLD, if American Academy of Forensic Sciences, if SOFT go out and recommend to their memberships that they need to adopt these standards. The legal community, certification bodies, accreditation bodies, funding bodies. Can we leverage NIJ somehow to include use of these standards in their funding opportunities? ISO, state regulatory boards, and also educational programs. How can we get the universities to teach these standards to the next generation of forensic scientists? So for each one of those, we kind of drafted out a description of why they're important, why we think that stakeholder has a role in this process, what approach we should suggest to them towards the implementation, why should they adopt these standards, and also how are we going to outreach to them. And the main thing is what barriers may that stakeholder have that they may say, we don't want standards. We don't think your standards are good. What barriers might we have to address with them to get them to accept the concept of the standards? And then an engagement plan. How are we going to do this, and how are we going to go through this process? And lastly, who's going to do this? So, since I'm here with the legal community, I'm going to go over a little bit about what we thought about the legal community can do to help us. First of all, description. Legal community, you all have probably the biggest stake in this as anybody. You all have extensive power when it comes to the court systems in mandating and looking at and evaluating whether or not the science that is being presented in your court follows an accepted standard. Also, rationale. The courts have the interest in the accuracy. It's you all who need to make sure that valid, sound scientific evidence is submitted into the court systems. And the court systems is the determining of guilt or innocent is in your court. It's not up for the forensic practitioner to do that. Stakeholders, basically, we came up with some organizations that we can go to. I'm sure there's more, and we're happy to hear from more. There's the Bar Association, the National Association of District Attorneys, the Association of Defense Trial Attorneys, and a whole list that people that we feel like we can go to and address and ask them to help us get these standards adopted. Barriers. What barriers might there be in the legal community? Sometimes there's suspicion from the defense side that anything comes from the prosecution side is law enforcement and against it. There's those biases and the lack of trust. And how can we show that these standards, as they're written and accepted by OSAC as fit for purpose and gone through all the review process, how can we get people to understand these are good for everybody, both the prosecution and the defense of the case? The preconceived concepts, the bias against standards, the consideration is you can't tell me what to do. How can we address these and convince people that that's not what we're doing? Also, with the implementation plan, outreach. Now, how can we actually do this? What outreach should we be doing to convince the legal community that these are standards that they want to make sure is adopted in their court systems. If we can make you all aware of it, just make you know that the standards are there and get you to know what the standards are and what they mean and what they can do for you. Also have attorneys who know and understand what the standards are, teach other attorneys and explain to them what the process is. Also provide training to those organizations we talked about earlier. And it's important for them to understand what the science is and what it means to their case and how it's going to affect the final results. Basically, the bottom line is to better educate everybody as to what the standard is, what it means, what it provides to the analysis that the forensic scientist is offering, and how it gives your case support in the presentation. But the bottom line, we are asking you what we need to do to help you all understand what the standards are that are being put on the registry and how we can adopt those. So basically considering moving forward from today on the consideration of developing and adopting these. First of all, I want to encourage, especially the attorneys in the room, join the ASB consensus body. Tell you right now, we only have 4 of our 12 consensus bodies with 25 people. A couple of those are because we're holding spots for attorneys because we don't have attorneys. 6 of our consensus bodies have attorneys represented on them, but we want more on it. So also you can go to the asb.aafs.org website and sign up and join in our fight and help us write these things. Next, when you see these documents come out for public comment, give it. Give us your public comment, give us your feedback. We have to listen to it, we have to respond to it. So pay attention when you get these emails or notifications, or stay and check out the different websites and provide feedback. And lastly, like I said, that draft implementation plan is currently on the OSAC website. So go on there, and we're requesting feedback on that by June 21st. In your thoughts, and give us ideas, because the bottom line is we want these things accepted and used, or we've spent a lot of time and money writing them if they're not going to get used. So, questions?
We'll go to the corner first.
Sure. So on your list of stakeholders that you reached out to, it's notable that 2 of the most prominent voices on the defense side in forensics, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and Innocence Project, aren't listed. How are these bodies, major criminal defense organizations that speak out and are active in forensic science reform, aren't on your list of stakeholders?
These were just the names we could come up and put on. These were just the names we could come up with and put on there. If you have more names, please send them to us.
And there may have been a misunderstanding, because the Criminal Defense Lawyers organization that she put up, I didn't even recognize, so maybe she meant the NACDL. That's the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and that's the main body. I've never heard of the other one.
Forensics, send that information to us so we can adjust it.
But one of the things I have 2 questions. One of the things you said is that all of the proposed standards that have been proposed so far come from OSAC in some sense. I thought that one of the document examination proposed standards did not come from an OSAC, but came from SWGDOC, and sort of bypassed OSAC. I mean, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I believe that was the case.
Okay, so what I was saying is that most of the seed documents, and to personally my knowledge, they were all submitted by OSAC. I can tell you out of the 89, One may have come from SWGDOC and they missed it.
Okay, I just happen to know about that one.
That's good, okay.
That's fine. My second, and this goes back to the whole stakeholder issue. What mechanism, if any, is there for asking the question about whether or not there's appropriate balance on a particular consensus body when you have a number of people in the universe of potentially interested people that can be counted in more than one category? So that you might have people, let's say, it could be any of these, but there could be people counted as government employees because that's a government thing, but they're also practitioners. So that you look at the way all of these are lined up, and if you cut it one way, you've got balance, but if you look at the cross membership in those groups, it's not balanced at all. There is a quorum or a majority that can be characterized as coming from essentially one interest group or one perspective. I think that's something of a problem with a few of these consensus bodies, and I wondered what mechanism there was for addressing it or even pointing it out if there's any reality to it.
I can tell you we have already had one person file a request concerning the membership just on that particular question on one of our consensus bodies, and they filed it with us, and we forwarded it on up to ANSI to make sure, and we supplied to ANSI, these are the people that are on that consensus body. This is the category they are in. This is why they are in this category. And this is, although this person may be in a laboratory, they've published and done research on this many different articles, and they can be considered a researcher. So even though you may have somebody that has different hats, and when you went down and we did, this was a 25-member committee, when we went down and hit every one of them, ANSI reviewed it and said that we did have appropriate balance representing. And so if there's another committee you have a concern about, let us know and we'll go back and look at it.
No, but even in regard to the one you just described, I don't know the details of it. Wouldn't the default position be that if there were people who fell into the categories independently, that would be a preferable selection? I mean, then you avoid the question. What is a researcher versus what is a practitioner or a government practitioner, whatever it is?
Well, and that is the consideration, is that many people in the field of forensics do basically wear different hats. And so is somebody that has researcher and academia or laboratory experience, should they be excluded just because they have two options? You have to look at the overall balance and look at the overall consideration of it. And that's what, when we choose those 7 to 25 people, we work very hard to make sure we look at that. And that's how come we're always open. If you have a concern, let us know, and we'll go back and look at the membership. And right now we're in the process of going through and redoing our memberships due to lack of participation and stuff.
I think we have time for one more question.
I think what Michael is addressing, I can address specifically. So, for example, in the question document subcommittee, consensus body, you have 24 members. And you can't have, according to your own regulations, you can't have more than 8 from one interest category. So let's assume you have 8 document examiners that are working in a public crime laboratory. You have another 4 that are working also in a public crime laboratory, but they're allowed to moonlight and have private practice. So they're allowed to opt or elect to be categorized as a private practitioner, even though they have a full-time job. And the problem here is that you're not really taking somebody's primary interest, stakeholder interest, into consideration. You're letting them elect what interest they're going to occupy. And you have 24 people in a consensus body. A quorum is 13. Okay? You have a quorum now deciding upon whether to approve a standard. So it could be 13 people, and a majority of those 13 decide. So in the case of a standard coming up for approval or public comments, you can have essentially 7 people deciding upon whether to approve the comments or whether to approve a standard. One of the concerns that I have both as an attorney, not just as a practitioner, is how can we view that as a true consensus standard given those parameters, as opposed to, let's say, as opposed to ISO or ASTM, where people can become members and vote collectively, and then you balance the interest of all those people that can join. You don't limit the number of people that can join. Any legitimate stakeholder has a right. So that's the question I have.
Okay, I can give you answers to your questions. 1, if you have a specific consensus body that you have a concern that it is not fair and balanced, please notify us officially and we will go and we will look at it. And like I said, that is part of our accreditation process. If there is a question or concern, we will address that and we will address it in writing. When it comes to the voting process, again, we have our 8 ANSI-approved categories of which we address, and it is simple majority, the passing. That's how come we encourage people, if you want to present, you want to make comments, you want to have public comments to those documents, we encourage you to do that.
Thank you, Lucy. I appreciate it.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Stolorow, and I am with NIST. So all of the opinions you hear are going to be my opinions and not those of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, nor the U.S. Department of Commerce or the U.S. government. So I want to begin by thanking Matthew Gamette for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's an honor to be with people with the expertise and experience that we've witnessed in the last 2 days. And it's wonderful to be able to join this group and the 64 of you who are sitting in the audience. I counted, I'm not savant. Anyway, I also want to thank Matt Riedel for his invitation and to thank ABA and ASCLD and the Innocence Project and Fordham University Law School for this invitation. If I had a chance to re-plan for this presentation, I've had an opportunity to speak a number of times in the last several years updating organizations about OSAC, and I think I would have done it differently than coming to speak to you the way I have today. I would probably have elected to have a very large, furry, rambunctious German Shepherd with me to sit next to me and jump up and lick my face and get your attention. So in the absence of that forethought and not bringing it with me, I want you to sit there and imagine that I have a very large dog right here next to me, okay? So while I'm giving that presentation, sit, Standard. Good boy. Okay. So depending on the question that you give when I'm finished, I will either answer the question or Standard will answer the question. So, all right. So I'd like to talk to you today about the current status of OSAC, a little, very briefly, about the speed with which we formed and began operations, some of the logistical challenges that we have had, and a very brief update. And then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the relationship that OSAC has with the standards development community, why we have embraced this framework and what we see the advantages being for using a framework that we have adopted. And then finally, to give you a little bit by way of vision of what it is that we hope to be able to achieve through the implementation process that Lucy articulated. So I know that in the legal community, there are a number of people who come to these presentations at Fordham that are either in school or new to the legal community, and you may not have seen or be familiar with the structure of OSAC. I'm not going to take the time to go through it today, but the website is nist.gov/forensics, and we have about 800 pages of content on our website, and it includes a lot of detail about the structure and organization of OSAC. So I'm not going to take time today to recapitulate how OSAC was formed or what it consists of, but some of the highlights are that we have currently 565 members, almost 300 affiliates. We have on file more than 2,400 applications because we have 3-year terms. Most organizations you join don't kick you out in 3 years. But one of the wisdom that went behind this decision was to try to bring in fresh blood. And as you can see, with 2,400 people who are interested in this, out of fairness and effectiveness, we think the idea of having 3-year terms with a 2-year term limit or 2-term limit is not only practical but justifiable. We have, I'm not going to go through the demographics, but it is balanced. We have representation from the legal community, from stakeholders including statisticians, metrologists, forensic science practitioners, academic researchers, and the legal community. So we have in the center, you can't see it on here, but one of the red circles in the center of our diagram, on the center of our diagram is the Legal Resource Committee. There are 11 members who serve 3-year terms. We have 3 judges. We have prosecutors, Defense and Innocence Project. Barry Scheck is one of the members of our Legal Resource Committee. So I don't want anyone in the innocence community to feel that you're underrepresented. Barry takes more than 1/11 of the time of our group, and you are adequately represented. My phone has an automatic turn off at 11 p.m. for Barry's calls, and so he'll have to wait until the following morning to call me. Okay, so we were announced in February of 2014 by way of a bilateral agreement between NIST and the Department of Justice. It established the commission and it established OSAC. And we have been moving along, and you will see the complete registry with 8 standards on it that exist today. It's been moving rather slowly, and the reason that you see the 2 OSAC frigates here is that the top one is giving you an illustration of what we have done in the first 3 years. We're moving along in the water like this. Okay? We have 8 standards that are currently on the registry. We have more than 200 that are in the pipeline. 70 have already gone before and exist in SDOs. I think there are 50 or so that are in ASB. So we are standing by waiting for the tsunami, and what will begin to happen in the next 3 years is the speed of this boat is going to look a lot more like that. So the registry has a gold background, and I'll explain in a little bit why we feel that the OSAC registry is something which represents an endorsement of 2 critical things that are in our charter. One is that we can demonstrate for scientific methods that these standards have technical merit. The second is that there's a reasonable standards development process. So the essential elements of ANSI is one example, but following consensus, developing consensus-based documentary standards is what we're doing. On this list, it's too small for you to read, but again, at the website, you can see we have representations from 5 different organizations, including ASTM, ISO, NFPA, National Fire Prevention Association, ANSI NIST, and we are soon going to be considering one from the American Dental Association. So placement on the OSAC registry means that the OSAC registry is public. It's available on a public website. It's something which is easy to find, and it includes things which we hope serves as a trusted repository for high-quality science-based standards and guidelines for forensic science. For every one of the standards that we have reviewed that made it to the registry, there are many that did not make the cut, that have been sent back to the SBO or have simply been rejected. And we feel that we are doing the right thing by making this selection very stringent and holding the standard that we're going to put on the registry to a high standard. That's the relationship that we have with the SDOs. I won't go through the law and the reasons why the Department of Commerce itself does not simply create standards, but the policy is whenever private standard developing organizations can be used, the law requires the federal government to go to those standard developing organizations, and we do. We comply with the law. We also are looking for a partnership. We want this mix, a rich mix. We have 13 different SDOs who have contacted us and stood up and said, we have an interest in the forensic arena, and we think that's a healthy environment. So we're convening, we're facilitating, and we're rewarding those SDOs that produce high-quality standards with technical merit and consensus-based development by placing them on a registry. And we hope the registry is going to be more prominent than the registries of the individual SDOs. And if we're successful in doing this, then our investment will have proved worthwhile. The OSAC registry is something which has to be a value proposition. There is no mandatory requirement to use standards in the United States in forensic science, with the exception of DNA, and the DNA Identification Act of 1994 actually empowers the director of the FBI to require those standards to be demonstrated by laboratories before DNA profiles will be added to the national DNA database called CODIS, or NDIS. With that exception, everything else, standards to be used by practitioners and to be subjected to cross-examination in a courtroom, have to be adopted voluntarily by these laboratories in order for them to be used or utilized. So that's one of the reasons for the implementation plan to have to be strategic. It must be a value proposition. So OSAC endorses these standards and promotes their adoption for forensic science providers. And while we recognize that accreditation bodies do audit to general laboratory standards, there are really very few discipline-specific standards that currently exist that can be audited against. So ultimately, our goal of the 800 members and affiliates of our organization is to develop science-based standards for each of the 25 forensic science disciplines for which we have distinct and separate subcommittees within OSAC, and to promote this widespread adoption. The other benefit of having an organization as large and seemingly unwieldy as OSAC is that we have all of the forensic science disciplines under the same umbrella. So we have cross-fertilization, we have some efficiencies, and certainly some communication between practitioners and sciences when it's appropriate for exchanging this cross-fertilization and harmonization. When there were 21 separate scientific working groups that NIJ decided in 2013 to change, they weren't working together, and one of the benefits and one of the goals that we have is to try to increase the uniform authority and power that the OSAC registry can bring both to the forensic science community, to practitioners, but also to the criminal justice system to help them find high quality standards that can be used to test individual case analyses when experts come to testify. So we have a high-level process map that I've put up here, and this is impossible to read. I don't expect you to do that, but it's a newly placed on our website. And I just wanted to show you in the next slide 2 critical areas of this process map that we think are really important. In the upper left-hand side, you see an arrow pointing to the upper leftmost part that says new document. So a new document comes into the process in the upper left. It comes out at the bottom right into the OSAC registry. So that little gold ellipse at the bottom is the OSAC registry. Well, there are 2 places for public comment. One of them is the large circle in the center, that is the SDO process. So OSAC fertilizes this SDO process. You have an opportunity, and the public has an opportunity to give input in the development of those standards while it's in the SDO. And then it comes out of the SDO, and it goes through the OSAC process, and we ask it again. We repeat it. Should this standard be placed on the registry? And you have an opportunity, as well as other OSAC members, of having comments recorded. Why do we ask OSAC members to make comments again through a process that they participated in from the beginning? The answer is this time it's public facing. So whatever those comments are, it can be found on the OSAC website along with the adjudication that stays with it historically. So 5 years from now, they're going back to look at it, they can say, what were the problems 5 years ago and how have we evolved since then? And if the answer is not a damn thing has been done in 5 years, then that's justification for taking action. So this is just a screenshot of what you see when you go on nist.gov/OSAC. These are 2 standards with comments and adjudication, and the little red arrows are depicting what the comment was and where you can find the adjudication. It's a link. So what you do is you click on that link and it will take you to the full documentation. So you have an opportunity to see exactly what people are saying during the open comment period. Finally, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the vision for standards implementation. How are we going to do this? And you've heard Lucy talk about the actual steps and who gets involved. These are a little bit more platitudes, but I'd like to at least give you a view of what I'm hoping this impact will be on the individual lab director and practitioner. Sit standard, I'm almost done. I wanted to say to you that, first of all, having good standards are really important. And I think if you haven't believed anything I've said today, is that there are folks in OSAC who are committed to improving the quality of the existing standards. But implementation is even more important. You can have a good standard if nobody uses it. It's the tree that falls over in the forest that makes a sound that nobody hears. The second is focus on improving the quality of forensic science standards and continue to accelerate. We are moving at a very slow pace. For 25 different disciplines, we only have 8 standards. I'd like to come back next year and tell you we have 88 standards or we have 188 standards. We're getting there, but standards development is slow. OSAC registry standards list continues to expand into all disciplines. So there are areas ranging from bite marks to question documents that are all over the map in terms of the completeness of dealing with practice for which we have testimony in court every day. Somebody's liberty is at stake, and we know that it's important that the quality of the science is the best that it can be. And we have a lot of research that still needs to be done. Until that time happens, we're not coming to a moratorium. It's going to continue every day. So our responsibility is to accelerate to try to catch up and improve the speed and the rate at which we are improving quality standards. The last is that standards implementation actually gains broad traction across our industry. And that's two places, at least two. One is in the laboratory. Practitioners get it, they embrace it, and they endorse it, they document it, so people can see with transparency how they have complied with the standard. The second is in court. Prosecutors should begin with, are you familiar with OSAC Standard 21? Did you use that in this case? How did you use that? How did you apply it? And if the prosecutor doesn't talk about it, the defense should say, what about OSAC Standard 21? Have you ever heard of that? Why haven't you heard of that? Or if you have, can you tell the court how you applied that? And if you didn't apply it, why? And what exception did you take? What are the limitations that you have? If you didn't follow this standard, explain to the court why we should listen to you today. If that became a practice, I can tell you the rush with which laboratory directors would be going to their staffs and saying, oh my God, did you hear what happened to Joe today? Sit, I'm okay. So I'm just saying that one of the things, I hit the wrong button, it's all right. One of the things that's a take-home message for you is that implementation is really critical, but the strategy and the tactics that are used for implementation have to win and provide a value proposition. And this joint partnership between the criminal justice community using these standards in the practice and litigation of criminal cases is just as important as getting laboratory practitioners to use them. So I have no idea where I am. You just touch one and hope that it... Here we go. Okay, so the final slide is simply to give you... Yes, is to give you... You skipped a bunch. No, I didn't. Well, there are ones after this, but it's up to you. We may have time to get into this. I don't know, but we're already over our time, aren't we? All right. So the only other thing I wanted to tell you, and I think this is up on the ASCLD website now available, we did a poll at ASCLD. There were 600 people there, 500 people in the audience, and we gave them an opportunity to ask questions about the implementation plan that you heard from Lucy. And when you look at all of the results that these questions had, what do you think about, would you implement standards if you started getting questions in court from prosecutors and defense attorneys about these standards? Would you use the standards if your state commission required you to use them? Or if the state legislature passed a law requiring laboratories to use them and so forth? And on average, what you see was 70 to 90% of the answers were either likely or very likely for all of the bullet points and stakeholder groups that we applied these questions to in ASCLD, and we had 90 respondents. So if you want to see the results of the questions, they're all pretty informative. Please feel free to go to the website on ASCLD and you can see the data, or you can leave me your card and I will send you the slide deck. It should be available anyway, the rest of the slide deck, correct?
I think so.
Okay. I'm sorry I'm over, Matthew, but all right.
Take questions if you've got other comments.
All right, are there any questions? No? Good. Well,
Standard doesn't get off that easy. Back in the corner.
This is an easy one. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing to ensure access to the ASTM standards, which aren't free for the legal practitioners who are going to use them, particularly for defense attorneys that aren't public defender offices?
Sure. And the answer, for those of you who didn't hear the question, well, what about access to ASTM standards that aren't free? That's a very easy answer for someone who works for the U.S. Department of Commerce. The SDOs are self-operating, with the exception of ASB that has a grant from the Arnold Foundation for 4 years. Everybody else has to pay for their operations, and they charge a whopping $75 for an unlimited access to any standards in ASTM that you want. So our answer is you need to work it out directly with ASTM, and you can have one person in your office pay a membership and you can reimburse them, and everybody else gets a chance to ask that individual for a copy of a standard. So if I were to say to you, OSAC is going to pay for them, and we're going to give access to 30,000 law enforcement agencies and prosecutors' offices and public defenders, you'd say that's a crazy idea. Well, we did. We did for 2 years. We paid $100,000 over a 2-year period to ASTM to give you access. 200 people asked for access. So you do the math, and we're figuring out this is way too expensive to give to ASTM to allow everyone to have free access. So you know what? You're going to have to do the best you can helping to support organizations like ASTM by paying for those standards. So ASB is free. NFPA, I think you have to pay. ADA, you have to pay, except for forensics. And their standards have already been allocated to be free for anyone who wants forensic standards in the American Dental Association. So every different entity has a different answer, and it's a different cost. And I wish I could tell you that we'll just keep on paying for it. I can't justify that expense anymore. Sarah.
I just wanted to commend the OSAC for basically in 4 or so years teaching hundreds of people in the forensic science community and the legal community how to write a standard, because that was something that a small group of people knew how to do, and now we have many, many, many more people across the country who have that skill. I have one suggestion and one question. One suggestion is, in addition to the common adjudication, at some point would it be possible to make the technical merit worksheets available with the standards in the common adjudication process? Because it's hard for us to know when we're commenting what research was integrated into the standard and what's not, because it's not always cited. And then my question is, that I previously thought that once a standard got on the registry, it would be considered a national standard, and that it would automatically be integrated into the accreditation process. So if it's not a national standard, what would need to happen to make the OSAC registry standards a national standard?
Okay, first of all, they can't become national standards unless there's national legislation. Congress would have to enact a law, like they did for the DNA Identification Act, and enable it through legislation. That's not happening anytime soon. So the next is the value proposition, where, like accreditation, 95% of the 400 government crime laboratories in the United States are accredited. That was voluntary. And I guess 10 states now have actually passed laws requiring crime laboratories in their jurisdictions, but there's still 40 who haven't. So the fact that more than 90% have decided independently to become ISO 17025 accredited demonstrates what a value proposition it is to laboratories. We have to do exactly the same thing, using carrots and sticks and other models to try to help implement it. But that's why we spent 6 months working on an implementation plan. And that is, how do you get the horse to actually drink the water? So we got all the standards there on the registry, but how do we get them implemented? And if we could wave a wand to get national requirements mandating these standards are implemented, or that accreditation bodies like ANAB can demand that they be, that they can accredit to those standards, that's great. But that's up to the customers. And ANAB is also a for-profit or at least an organization that has to satisfy customers, or they'll lose the customers. There has to be a demand on the customer's part. We want to be audited to these OSAC standards. So until that happens, Sarah, there's nothing more I can tell you. Thank you very much for your question. Standard getter.
We have time for one more question.
All right.
I'd like to second her comment. I mean, I'm very grateful for the work that OSAC has done, and it's given me and many of my colleagues a sense of security in terms of the rigor with which standards have to be scrutinized before they can go on the OSAC registry. My concern is that there are certain disciplines that have opted to avoid that OSAC registry, I'll call it good housekeeping seal of approval, and are now opting to try to force the standards through directly through an SDO like the ASB.
Sure.
And I have real concerns about that. I don't know what can be done. I don't think you can mandate the good housekeeping seal of approval of OSAC. I just don't know. But I know it's problematic.
Well, so what we have done is to simply take a snapshot cross-section of reality of the way it operates in a voluntary program in the United States, where the government doesn't create standards unless there is none in the private sector. We embrace the private sector. It's working for a lot of industries. How do we answer your question? And the answer, to be honest with you, is that the individual SDOs will continue to put out standards. We have a registry, and if their standard is good enough to make the registry, it gets endorsed, whether they've asked for it or not. So if there are organizations, let's just take SWGDoc. SWGDoc decides it's going to run off and go to ASB on its own, make a stand. We can review that. In fact, we don't even need an invitation. We can review that, and if it's good, it goes on the registry. If it isn't good, it doesn't get on the registry. So the only thing we're saying about things that are on the registry is that they met the requirement. If they're not on the registry, we're saying nothing. It doesn't mean that it's a bad standard. It's just that it wasn't good enough to make it to the registry.
Do you also publish the fact that it was reviewed that did not make the registry?
No, it's a one-tailed test. So to use a statistician, if it's good enough, it makes the registry. If the answer is it's not on the registry, there are so many answers to the question, why isn't it on the registry? And I can start talking, or let standard do the talking.
Yeah.
It's going to take a long time to explain why it didn't make the standard. And to be honest with you, it only matters to the SDOs who are saying, why aren't any of our standards up on the OSAC registry? So the bait essentially is, the payout is if you're good enough, you get to the registry. So it really is a one-tailed test. All right, and if you can just allow Alicia to ask her one question. She was so patient.
Actually, I can ask you later. I'm just, as a person ignorant about the systems, I am very confused about ASB and ASCLD and all of the other ones. I don't understand how they work together.
I have been waiting. Standard and I have been waiting for you to ask that question for so long, Alicia. Let's talk about one standard deviation, two standard deviations, likelihood ratios, frequentist.
Okay, you got it.
Equilibrium, should we go on? So, we don't speak the same language. And those of us who have 11 different definitions for standard,
Yeah.
and you who have 11 different definitions for probability, will probably never be able to communicate without an interpreter. So why don't we take this offline?
Yes.
And thank you very much for your attention and your patience.
I also want to thank the members of this committee. I think what we were trying to demonstrate today is the advancement of standards and the advancement of forensic science in this country, and many of you in this room are contributing in great ways to that. So again, let's thank our great committee.